Welcome to Nourish MD, Doctor-Dietitian Dialogues, where doctors and dietitians empower you about your health and discuss and provide a better path to health and wellness. Proudly presented by Concierge Medical Practice Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA, with your hosts, registered dietitians and nutritionist, Lauren Papanos and Romana Brennan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nourish MDs. You're joined today by both myself, Lauren Papanos, and Romana Brennan, your registered dietitians. And we are so excited to talk to you about the role of urinary health and UTI management and the role that nutrition and supplements and lifestyle can have in preventing and managing these different urinary conditions. So thank you so much for joining us. And hi, Romana. So excited to talk with you about this.
Hello. Yeah, let's jump right in. So I do want to first start by just describing a little bit of what are we even talking about in terms of the body system involved in what we call urinary health. You know, we of course have our urinary tract, but the system does involve our kidneys, our ureters, our bladder, as well as our urethra. So just a little anatomy lesson for everyone today first, but really focusing today on both frequent and recurrent UTIs, as well as increased urgency and frequency. That's another common complaint that we get among patients. So, Lauren, any other that you would like to mention that you see in patients?
I think those are the most common. I mean, with anything like urinary related, there can be so many other types of correlations with like the gut and pelvic pain. And it's all linked together. So I think, we'll talk about some of like the correlation with the gut and how what we eat influences that. But, anything that patients are experiencing that's impacting their bladder and their pelvic floor and maybe even like infections that they're experiencing as well, I think is part of the conversation we're addressing today.
Yeah, absolutely. And to zero in a bit on those recurrent UTIs, of course, this is really important to address because we don't want those infections to move even further upstream. We want to prevent those kidney infections as much as possible. So we know, just a little background on UTIs, women are actually up to 30 times more susceptible to getting recurrent UTIs, primarily because of the shorter length of the urethra. And these infections are most often caused by an E. coli infection. We know that there are other pathogens such as Klebsiella and Citrobacter that can also be implicated in these infections. And we know that there are things that we can support these infections through dietary supplement strategies, which we're going to chat more about today. Also to note that, of course, we see, unfortunately, with postmenopausal women, recurrent UTIs are more common. Women, as we get older, are more susceptible to UTIs primarily due to the lack of estrogen, in addition to some other factors. But estrogen does play a big role in maintaining a healthy environment that makes us less susceptible to UTIs. So, when we reach that postmenopausal age and that estrogen decreases, we are also decreasing the proliferation of lactobacillus species in the vaginal tissue, decreasing proper balance of acids and base. So talking more about the pH, that estrogen plays a role in helping maintain that balance. These factors are all protective against UTIs. So when we enter that period of our life and estrogen decreases, then we are also decreasing those lactobacillus species, decreasing the muscle function of the vaginal area, the muscle tone and the epithelium, so those tissues. And this environment, a perfect storm for those UTIs. So in case you're wondering why you maybe have entered menopause and now you're getting more UTIs when you never used to have them, that can be a contributing factor.
Yeah, and lactobacillus is a probiotic. So we have in our microbiome, it's basically the makeup of both good and bad bacteria. I like to think of it as like soldiers on the battlefield, right? You need to have good and bad to go to war. But we want to have just the right balance of the two. And we need enough lactobacillus to be able to do a lot of different things. But like low lactobacillus levels are also correlated with things like bacterial vaginosis or BV, as well as recurrent yeast infection. conditions. So the makeup of these beneficial microbes in in our urinary health, as well as in the vaginal microbiome, is really important. And lactobacillus is commonly found in foods that we eat. You've probably purchased yogurts before and seen that it has lactobacillus in there. Sometimes they add it into yogurts that are like more non-dairy as well. But really, anytime you ferment anything, you're going to get lactobacillus formation. So that's one of the benefits of fermented pickled vegetables, things like kimchi and sauerkraut and kefir, kombucha. They have lactobacillus species in there. Those foods can be problematic, however, for some people, not really as it relates to the urinary health, but more so if there's also pre-existing gut issues going on at the same time. So if you've ever had those foods and you've noticed that you get like extreme bloating afterwards, or stomach upset, or you get like a flushing, or more of this like allergy low grade response, that can happen because these foods are also really high in what's called histamine. And histamine can be really problematic when we don't have the ability to break down adequate amounts of it. So for some people, it's better to go the supplementation route with lactobacillus. And definitely if you're like having these acute issues ongoing and recurrent, it's probably really frustrating for you. And so we generally would advise being on a lactobacillus-based probiotic just as a baseline support to help to be able to inoculate that environment with adequate amounts. There also, for women, are vaginal suppositories that also contain lactobacillus. So that's also an option where you can actually locally insert that lactobacillus to be able to provide even more additional support. So now you've got it in the gut colonizing, and then you've also got it in the vaginal microbiome as well. So of course, you've got food, and then you've also got the supplemental form of things. With outside of UTIs, as we age, a lot of times there's an increase in frequency and urgency that also occurs. And a lot of times this happens for women, maybe after having babies, because that impacts pelvic floor. But it can also happen in men as well. And I think that a lot of the common recommendations are around just like either, maybe people will just kind of inadvertently like stop drinking as much water, or maybe the recommendation is to drink less at each sitting. But I'm curious as to what you also see and practice, Romana, with strategies that may be supportive for helping with this increased urgency and frequency.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely still emphasize the importance of appropriate hydration, just because, especially if someone does have a UTI, we know how important it is to stay hydrated to be able to flush out the bladder, flush out that urinary system effectively. But even in the case of this increased frequency and urgency, surprisingly, a lot of people may not know the connection between stress. And I had this explained to me by actually a pelvic floor physical therapist. Some people, like myself, carry our stress in our trap muscles, so like those upper shoulder, between the shoulder and the neck. And other people actually carry it more so in their pelvic floor. So those are two parts of the body that are really susceptible to holding on to tension from stress. And so being able to identify if that is true for you. If you notice a lot of clenching in your pelvic region, and when you're consciously relaxing, if you notice that there's a release in your sitting area, pelvic floor type region, that can be indicative that you hold more of your stress in that area. And making sure that we have these stress reduction practices, relaxation practices can actually help a lot. So our pelvic floor is a combination of all these muscles. It's almost like a hammock that holds together this region of our pelvis, really, although our organs need to be held up by our pelvic floor as well. So if we are in this hyper tense state and our pelvic floor muscles are never relaxing, this contracting and relaxing isn't happening because it's just kind of locked up. So that can be an issue for the frequent urination, and also some level of incontinence, both bowel incontinence and urinary incontinence too, if we're never able to release and have that appropriate relaxation and contraction. So stress management is a really important lifestyle piece to that, and noting if you're holding tension in your pelvic floor versus maybe elsewhere in your body or both. But a lot of people, until they're aware of that, may not realize that they're actually holding tension there and not able to relax.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, and I think that it's always so important whenever we're having these discussions to think about more of like the biological component of things, but then also the structural aspect of things, right? Because they both kind of work together in tandem with anything that we're talking about. And you'll see that in our future episodes too, where we get into things like the gut and, just the brain and things of that sort, right? Like there's always kind of two different components that are working together. Let's get into talking about some of those more like chemical based solutions, which is what we find in nutrition, right? Nutrition provides the natural chemicals through enzymes and vitamins and minerals that help support our cell function in our body. And this includes our urinary health. But there's also ways in which that we eat these foods that impact things like our digestion and our metabolism and the amount of blood sugar that is released, as well as how long it stays elevated. And the blood sugar response to the way that we eat is really important for our urinary health, because we know that in unmanaged type sugar issues, such as like type 2 diabetes, that there can actually be glucose in the urine, and that can also be a driving factor for UTIs as well. So let's talk a little bit about that, Romana. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the role of blood sugar balance and maybe some of the things that we can do when we eat to be able to help manage our blood sugar better?
Absolutely. And I think we'll get into this too in future episodes. So stay tuned when we chat more about that. But when it comes to blood sugar balance, we know that when we eat carbohydrates, we're getting this surge of glucose into our body. And that surge of glucose, our body is able to release what's called insulin. This is one of our metabolic hormones. And insulin helps mobilize glucose, taking it from our bloodstream to our liver and our muscles for it to then be stored. And we really need this response to work efficiently. Otherwise, we might have increased glucose in the blood. So you might notice this on a blood test as fasting glucose. That typical range, we like to be between 69 and 99. You might notice if your blood sugar is slightly what we would call dysregulated, you might notice maybe you're in the hundreds, 110. Approaching that is really indicative that there's some blood sugar dysregulation that needs to be addressed. We might also notice your insulin levels being increased just because your body is producing that insulin, but maybe that effectiveness isn't quite there. The ability for the insulin to, again, mobilize that glucose. Maybe puzzle pieces aren't quite matching up. So we want that insulin response to be effective, and also for the insulin to be able to mobilize that glucose. And that process is what we consider insulin sensitivity. So if we are insulin insensitive, we might notice that insulin in our blood be increased because, again, those connections aren't quite firing the way that we would want them to. So that's just a little bit about blood sugar balance and how we can eat to make sure that our blood sugar is balanced and that our meals are conducive to this process. Definitely making sure that we are balancing our carbohydrates with protein and fat. When we consume protein and fat, we know that we're actually slowing down the speed at which this glucose is being digested. These carbohydrates are being digested and broken down into glucose so that it's a slower release into our bloodstream, which helps that activity of the insulin. So incorporating appropriate levels of protein into our meals and snacks, as well as an appropriate level of fat. Now, of course, some of our proteins, like our animal-based proteins, maybe our eggs, like egg yolks as opposed to egg whites, they already come with some fat, so we might not need to add an extra source of fat to that. But things like our plant-based proteins, tofu, tempeh, things of that sort, even beans have a good source of protein, but we also want to pay attention to the fact that they also have carbohydrates. So it's important to balance those out and make sure that we're considering, of course, the carbohydrates that are in the food as well as the protein and the fat, and making sure that we have the protein and the fat to balance out the carbohydrates.
Enjoy high-quality supplements shipped right to your door with full script through Private Physicians Medical Associates, PPMA. Reap the health benefits of pharmaceutical-grade vitamins while saving 5% on all orders. Set up your free PPMA account today. Visit privatemds.com.
So that's a bit about blood sugar balance. Lauren, why don't you transition us to hydration and talking more about, again, in the case of urinary frequency and urgency, we might have some issues there, but let's talk a little bit more about hydration.
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, hydration is really important to keep everything flushed and to also support our cellular function too within our body so that everything is staying optimally hydrated, our cells are functioning as they should. And I think that one of the common things we see with patients is that as they start to deal with more of this like incontinence issue, they start drinking less water because they don't want to go to the bathroom as much. And I know that it can be a pain to go to the bathroom more frequently, but it is a good sign when you are urinating every hour, every couple of hours, that your kidneys are firing and that you are naturally detoxifying, because one of our detox mechanisms is through our kidneys. So we really want to ensure that you're at least meeting 64 ounces of water per day. That should be spread out evenly. You don't want to necessarily like go and drink 64 ounces in one sitting, because your bladder can probably only hold about 32 ounces at a time. So you can expect that if you drink half of that at one sitting, that you're going to have a full bladder. You're going to have to really go to the bathroom. But if we can spread that out more evenly over maybe each meal or a couple of servings per day, then that should be a much more manageable amount, to where you only have to empty your bladder every couple of hours, and that may feel less frequent for the situations like if you're on the road traveling or you're working and you don't have the ability to go to the restroom as frequently. But we want to make sure we're at least hitting that. And I would say that I don't see a lot of individuals hitting that are dealing with these issues. And if you are worried about that, then remember that the body is adaptive. And so if you're maybe right now at 30 ounces and you're like, there's no way I can get up to 64 ounces, my bladder will no way be able to do that, then let's go slow. Let's add 5-10 ounces at a time. Like I said, slow, kind of breaking that up over the course of the day so that we can eventually get you up to at least 64 ounces, with the optimal goal being about half your pounds of weight in ounces per day. So if you weigh 150 pounds, we're ideally shooting for about 75 ounces of water per day. If you weigh 200 pounds, we're shooting for about 100 ounces of water per day. And that really is before sweat loss. So if you're very active, you are exercising a lot and losing a bunch of water, then we need to be adding about 16 ounces of additional fluid per hour of exercise, of vigorous exercise where there's sweating happening. So as you can see, 64 ounces really is kind of on that minimum. And then it could be even upwards of 150 ounces of water per day. We definitely don't need, though, close to a gallon of water per day, like you might have heard before. I think that is a bit excessive for anyone. And when we're talking about hydration, it's really important that we're not just always trying to shoot for like this fully clear urine. It really should have a very light lemonade color to it. So if you look at a urine output chart, there is different ranges of urinary color. There's clear, then you've got your light lemonade, which is like a very light pale yellow, and then all the way up to apple juice, which would be more of that orangey brown type color. We really want to aim for somewhere in the middle that's closer to that light lemonade color. And so if you're noticing that when you're waking up in the morning, there's a really dark color, or when you've been drinking water throughout the day, you're getting into the clear often, then that's a sign that we may need to balance out your water to your electrolyte intake to be able to make sure that we're actually using this water efficiently. Because remember that hydration isn't just water. Hydration is the balance between water and electrolytes, things like sodium, potassium, and magnesium and such. So that's the waterfront, but there's other types of beverages that can be problematic. These are especially things that are caffeinated. We know that caffeine is a natural diuretic, and that means that you are going to feel the urgency to go to the bathroom more. And that when that happens, that you might also notice that you are, maybe even creating a little bit of dehydration, we know that from the research, caffeine only really becomes a diuretic when you hit close to 400 milligrams per day. So if you're worried about drinking 1 cup of coffee or 1 cup of tea per day, that is not creating a diuretic effect. It is not quite enough to be able to hit that threshold. But if you are drinking several cups of coffee per day, you are drinking energy drinks or the combination of the two, then this is where we're really going to see this diuretic effect happen from that caffeine intake. But caffeine has other components in it, like tannins and things that can irritate our bladder. So it's not just the caffeine that can cause this effect to happen. There can be other components to it. And that might be why you notice that when you drink caffeine, you do go to the bathroom more often, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is dehydrating you. Okay. There's other drinks that you might have heard of before, such as cranberry juice and its role in preventing UTIs. Cranberry juice may be an effective strategy. There's a couple of different reasons why. One of those is because cranberry juice also contains tannins like coffee and tea do. And those tannins have been shown to help reduce the colonization of that E. coli, which is that bacteria that is commonly correlated with UTIs. However, with cranberry juice, we have to be careful because it also is really high in sugar. And as we mentioned earlier, the role of blood sugar balance is very critical. And so I generally recommend utilizing more of like a cranberry juice extract so that you don't have the sugar content at quite the volume that a traditional cranberry juice would have. Or there even are cranberry juice pills and things that you can take as well that don't have the level of sugar that a whole bottle of cranberry juice would have. There's also a compound that's in cranberry juice that's called D-mannose that we'll talk about a little bit more when we start to talk about vitamin considerations. But this is something else that can help with that colonization of those bacteria that can cause UTIs and recurrent UTIs. So hydration is essential. The right balance of it is even more essential. The way you spread it out throughout the day and being mindful of caffeinated beverages and that can really irritate the bladder and can increase that urgency and, that irritation can be something really valuable. So we talked a little bit about how to pair foods together and why that's important to have each of these different food components like protein and fiber and fats to be able to provide a healthy blood sugar response. But why don't you just tell us a little bit more, Romana, about the role that fiber has in supporting our overall urinary health?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to note too, backtracking a bit in terms of if you're utilizing that urinary chart to measure your hydration status, if you are someone who is taking any kind of supplement with a B vitamin, that is going to alter the color of your urine, maybe making it more of like a neon yellow type color. So if that you find that a helpful strategy to measure your hydration status and you are taking a supplement that contains B vitamins, just something to note that it's going to naturally alter the color. Even if you're taking, for example, a multivitamin, because it usually has some content of B vitamins. So just something to note before we move on from that. But yeah, nutrition the fundamentals don't change too much based on your health conditions. We still want to make sure that we are getting adequate fruits and vegetables daily, getting fiber. Lauren, you mentioned that urination is such a key method in which our bodies detox. And we know that eliminating our bowels is also so important. We want to have at least a movement a day, and consuming enough fiber is going to be really important for that. We know that fiber in the context of our general health and well-being also helps regulate our cholesterol. So you might have seen it on an oatmeal package where oatmeal can help maintain healthy levels of cholesterol. And that's because oatmeal contains fiber. And fiber not only helps bind cholesterol, but that binding helps us to eliminate any excess cholesterol from our bodies. So cholesterol is made from our liver and released in our bile in order to help us mobilize the nutrients that we're getting from our food. But then we need to ensure that we are eliminating every day in order to prevent that cholesterol from then being reabsorbed into our body, and then it goes back into circulation. And that's kind of how this cholesterol tends to build up in our body. One of the ways, of course, this can happen a variety of different ways. But ensuring that we're having enough fiber can help us with our bowel movements and also help regulate cholesterol levels. And then ensuring that we're getting healthy fats. I mentioned that balance between proteins, fibers, and cholesterol, but we want to make sure that the fat sources that we're getting are from omega-3 sources, for example. So those fatty fish, also from avocados, extra virgin olive oils, as opposed to more of those hydrogenated vegetable oils. Processed foods are going to contain more of those fats just in order to, maintain texture and consistency and things like that. And then you mentioned it with the cranberry juice, but making sure that we're limiting or eliminating as much of those sugar sweetened beverages, the processed foods that have the added sugars, and maybe some of those added fats that are not as healthy of fat choices. When it comes to balancing our blood sugar, we tie this all together in terms of the sugar piece of things. We want to make sure that we're balancing our blood sugar so that our microbiome can stay in balance between those good soldiers, those bad soldiers, and make sure that the pH, so this acid-base balance, which is in large part regulated by the types of bacteria that we have, we want to make sure that that pH is in balance, so that we don't create an environment that can then proliferate further infections or make us susceptible to getting those infections. So nourishing our microbiome through feeding it the right foods to make sure that we are creating the proper environment that can promote and maintain general health and well-being. That's the name of the game here, and why we want to make sure that we're nailing down those nutrition fundamentals. And then once we have those fundamentals really set in stone, then we can layer on more of the supplements, maybe including more of certain foods, excluding more of particular foods that are more customized to you, making it more personalized. That's where the personalized nutrition side of things comes in, but really nailing down those nutrition fundamentals is key for all individuals.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned an important thing about the, a lot of these things we're talking about with like nutrition, I think are very like just basic nutrition fundamentals, like you said, right? And I think that sometimes people go to the other extreme too, I see, where they end up just doing like a full-blown ketogenic diet or more of like a carnivore diet where they are not eating any sugar, but they're eating a lot of protein and not enough fiber and vegetables and fruits. And it's important that you don't do that, because these plants that are the vegetables and the fruits, for example, are what are helping to be able to support the pH of your urinary tract that's going to help prevent UTIs. And when you eat a very high protein diet, it does create more acidic urine. And so we need protein. It's very important, but we want to have the right balance of protein to plants, because those plants do the right thing in terms of balancing out that pH. And this pH plays a really big role in the ability for these different bacteria and things to colonize and create infection in the body. So plants and also protein at the same time. It's not one or the other.
100%. And also too, something that we haven't mentioned that maybe is worth noting, this is not just a conversation for women. Men certainly can have recurrent UTIs and can suffer from urinary health conditions. So this really is a conversation for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alrighty. Shall we dive into supplements, Lauren? I know we've touched on probiotics and you mentioned D-mannose, but I would love to just provide our listeners with a little bit more information on that.
Yeah, we kind of gave you a sneak peek into some of these, but they, for good reason, right? These supplements can be extremely powerful for several different types of urinary health, even down to pregnancy. These strands of probiotics can be really important because they're going to help be able to colonize the vaginal microbiome, especially in the case of a vaginal delivery. So these are probiotics that are especially from lactobacillus-based strands. And there's many different types of lactobacillus. When you go to the grocery store and you buy like yogurts, it usually just says lactobacillus spp. It doesn't really specify the type of lactobacillus, but we have lactobacillus rhamnosus, lactobacillus reuteri that are out there. And these two lactobacillus strains, rhamnosus and reuteri, are really where the research has been done on a lot of the benefits to urinary health. So there are actual probiotic supplements that we have access to that can provide these at the right dosages to be able to, like I said, colonize the gut with adequate amounts of this lactobacillus. There's also vaginal suppositories for women that can be purchased and utilized to provide even more additional support of lactobacillus. And typically I find for women, for both of these to be beneficial. With men, we may just have to use a higher dosage of that lactobacillus orally so that you're getting adequate amounts of it to help colonize the gut. And then we also have that D-mannose, like I mentioned, which is a sugar. It's very similar to like any type of sugar that you eat. It's one of the active compounds in cranberry. And there's been some good research on the role of D-mannose in really being able to block that E. coli, which was that bacteria that really creates a lot of these UTI type issues, being able to block that from adhesion. So basically from like attaching and invading the cells that are in our urinary tract. So it's going to help prevent potentially the colonization of these bacteria from creating a infection. So that can also be a really awesome option. We just want to make sure that with both of these, the probiotics and the D-mannose, that we're talking about sourcing of the brands that you're using that are quality and the dosage of them as well, because we want to make sure you're getting to the therapeutic dose that is really needed. A lot of times if you just go into the grocery store and buy these off the shelf, they're usually at much lower dosages than what would be used clinically and therapeutically. And that's where working with a practitioner can be really helpful so you can find the right supplements at the right dosage. So Romana, let's just kind of wrap things up and maybe you can just touch on a little bit. I know you talked about earlier, the role that stress reduction and stress support has in our urgency and frequency because of the role in the pelvic floor. But I know that there's also a little bit of research on things like acupuncture, also exercise. Is there any information or little tips and tidbits that you can share with us about the role that those have in urinary health?
Yeah, so there has been some research to suggest that acupuncture can help especially reduce recurrent UTIs in healthy adult women. So I thought that was super interesting and worth noting. So if that is something, if you're open to alternative medicine, some of those complementary forms of medicine, certainly alongside your primary care and any of those other preventative measures that we've discussed today, then you might want to consider acupuncture if you're suffering from recurrent UTIs. And then, of course, physical activity. We need to make sure that we are sweating. Sweating is a really important additional way that we can detoxify our body. So detoxifying through elimination, through urination, bowel elimination, as well as sweating. And we know the benefits of physical activity also for mental health and emotional health, as well as physical health. So certainly a key lifestyle aspect for maintaining proper health and wellness, even as it pertains to urinary health. So that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Be sure to tune in next month where Lauren and I will be discussing gut health. And we have 3 total episodes next month. We're really excited to spend that extra time with you all and give you all the 411 on gut health. So super excited. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We will catch you next week.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Nourish MD, Doctor Dietitian Dialogues. This podcast is intended for general educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult with your healthcare provider before beginning any nutrition or supplement recommendations. Sign up for our mailing list so you'll never miss an episode of our wellness journey. See the podcast description for the link.